Senator from Kentucky.
I rise in opposition to raising the debt ceiling.
The Senate's in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent that we vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection. Senator from Kentucky.
I rise today in opposition to raising the debt ceiling. I rise in particular in opposition to raising the debt ceiling without getting any sort of spending reform or budgetary reform in return. In fact, it will be completely the opposite.
Rand Paul absolutely unloads on the Obama administration for what he called reckless spending, endless borrowing, and handing Washington a blank check with America's future on the line.
We will be raising the debt ceiling in an unlimited fashion. We will be giving President Obama a free pass to borrow as much money as he can borrow in the last year of his office. No limit, no dollar limit. Here you go, President Obama, spend what you want. We do this while also exceeding what are called budget caps. We've been trying to have spending restraint in Washington. It hasn't worked very well, but at least there are some numbers that government is not supposed to exceed. These include spending caps for military spending as well as domestic spending. When I first arrived in 2010, I was part of a movement called the Tea Party movement. We came into prominence, and I was elected primarily because I was concerned about the debt. Worried about the debt that we were leaving to our kids and our grandkids, worrying that we were destroying the very fabric of the country with debt. We came here in 2010 and we negotiated and negotiated. And the President Obama said, I won't negotiate with you. He says, I won't negotiate with a gun to my head. The media all said, you just always have to raise the debt ceiling. It's irresponsible to use that as leverage to get reform. But you know what? We did get reform. The conservatives put forward something called cut, cap, and balance. It was passed overwhelmingly in the House, blocked in the Senate, but ultimately there was something passed called sequestration, which put caps on both military and domestic spending. And it did slow down the rate of growth of government for a little while. This is the problem with Congress. Congress will occasionally do something in the right direction, and then they take one step forward and two steps back. In 2013, we gave up on the sequester, and we added back in about $60 billion worth of money. Now we're doing the same thing again. We're going to add back in, this time, $80 billion, $50 billion in 2016, another $30 billion in 2017. We're doing the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be using the leverage of the debt ceiling, saying, we're not raising it again until you reform your ways, until you begin spending only money you have. Instead, we're doing the opposite. We're saying, here, Mr. President, you can raise the debt as much as you want. You can spend as much as you want while you're in office, and we're going to do nothing. And in fact, we're going to help you. We're going to exceed the caps so everybody gets what they want. So everyone in Washington is going to get something. The right's going to get more military money. The left's going to get more welfare money. The secret handshake goes on, and the American public gets stuck with the bill. Now, I think one of the most important things we do is defend the country. If you ask me to prioritize this spending, I would say we got to defend the country above and beyond and before all else. But that doesn't mean we're stronger or safer if we're doing this from bankruptcy court. I think the number one threat to our country, the number one threat to our security is debt, it's this piling on of debt. The debt threatens our national security, and yet we just want to pile it on, pile it on. This deal will do nothing but explode the debt. In fact, it doesn't even limit how much the debt can go up. We're giving the president a blank check. We're in the middle of a filibuster. This filibuster will go on till about 1 o'clock in the morning, and then we will find out who the true conservatives in this town are. If you're a conservative, you will say, there is no way I'm going to vote to give an unlimited power to the president to borrow money. If you're a conservative, you're going to say, we shouldn't be exceeding the budget caps. If anything, we should be passing more stringent budget caps. It disappoints me greater than I can possibly express that the party that I belong to, that should be the conservative party, doesn't appear to be conservative. This is a big problem. I've asked about I'm traveling the country and I ask Republicans everywhere. I've yet to meet a single Republican who supports this deal. In the House, they voted on this yesterday. You know what the vote was? 2-1 among Republicans to say this is a god-awful deal and we shouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. It's a terrible deal. House Republicans understood this. We should be doing the opposite. We should be taking the leverage of saying we're not going to raise the debt ceiling unless we get reform. Instead, we went to the president and said, here, raise the debt ceiling as much as you can possibly spend over the next year, and we'll let you exceed the budget caps. It's irresponsible. It shows a lack of concern for our country and for the debt, and it should go down in defeat. When I ran for office in 2010, the debt was an enormous issue, and the debt was $10 trillion. Some of us in the Tea Party were concerned because it had doubled in the last 8 years. It doubled from 5 to 10 under a Republican administration. And many of us were adamant that Republicans needed to do a better job. We had added new entitlement programs. We had added new spending, and the deficit got worse under Republicans. Now we're under a Democrat president, and it's set to double again. This president will add more to the debt than all of the previous presidents combined. So we're going to go from 10 trillion now to nearly 20 trillion. We may get close to 20 trillion, and now that we've increased the debt ceiling an unspecified amount, we may well get to 20 trillion by the time this president leaves. Is it a problem? Some people say that's just a big number. I don't know what $1 trillion is. Well, if you want to imagine $1 trillion, take $1,000 bills and put them in your hand. $1,000 bills, 4 inches high, is $1 million. But if you want to have $1 trillion in $1,000 bills, it would be 63 miles high. We're talking about an amount of money that is hard to fathom, and you say, what does that mean? How does that hurt me or my family? Economists say that we are losing 1 million jobs a year to the burden of debt. Economists also say when your debt becomes as large as your economy, that you are in a worrisome place. That when the debt is as large as the economy, there's a possibility that you may enter into a period when you might suffer a panic or a collapse or a burden so great that your economy can't withstand it. 2008, we were very close to a panic. I think we get closer with each day. The number one priority up here shouldn't be trying to scrounge around and find new money to spend. It should be trying to conserve. It should be doing something that some say is radical, but I say is the absolute essence of common sense, and that is we should spend what comes in. So often up here, things become partisan, and people just want to point fingers and say, oh, it's that party that did it. They're the ones responsible for the debt. But I want to let you in on a secret. This is a secret that goes on and on and on up here. It is something I call the unholy alliance. It is the unholy alliance between right and left. They both have sacred cows they want to spend money on. So instead of saying, you know what, the debt is a real problem and we both have to conserve in both areas, they both get together secretly and raise the money for their sacred cows. So on the right, we are busting the limits because the right wants more military spending. The left wants more for welfare. The unholy alliance, a secret handshake, and what gets worse? The debt. We're borrowing $1 million every minute, and it's not going to end in a pretty way. What do other conservatives have to say about this deal? Steve Moore at the Heritage Foundation writes, it's the worst budget deal to be negotiated by the GOP since George H.W. Bush violated his No New Taxes pledge in 1990. Rush Limbaugh says, the Republican Party cannot campaign by running around blaming the Democrats for destroying the budget, for overspending, for threatening the very fabric of the country. They can't do it because they're now complicit.
Prior to diving in, please click the subscribe icon since this video serves as a flashback to an era when a handful of politicians in the Capitol actually had the courage to declare the financial deficit a legitimate emergency rather than ignoring the massive sums of money involved. The footage you recently viewed featuring Rand Paul stands as a fiercely direct critique of the financial strategies utilized by the Obama White House throughout the intense borrowing limit debates of the previous decade, and this address remains remarkably pertinent today because virtually all of his cautions have grown substantially more severe. The core of his presentation rested on a fundamental assertion that the former president and liberal lawmakers desired boundless credit capabilities without committing to any meaningful fiscal adjustments in return. He viewed this approach as hazardous, reckless, and entirely counterproductive because lawmakers were getting ready to grant the executive branch an unrestricted financial pass rather than compelling the government to slash expenditures or restructure its budget, which left him absolutely livid. The element that truly elevated his address was his sheer bluntness, as he refused to soften his words while charging the current leadership with treating the borrowing threshold as a trivial procedure rather than a blaring alarm indicating the nation was burning through cash way beyond its actual income. According to his perspective, federal officials had completely abandoned any facade of caring about economic discipline, as the overarching dialogue transitioned from strategies for lowering the deficit to figuring out exactly how much extra cash they could loan. Which is striking considering this occurred shortly following the huge market crash when citizens witnessed the state massively inflate its budget to combat the recession. A large number of right-leaning voters felt that the Capitol had absorbed zero lessons from the economic disaster, noting that elected officials relentlessly enlarged the state instead of restricting cash flows and bringing back financial sanity, a deep resentment that ultimately propelled the grassroots conservative faction where he emerged as a premier spokesperson. During this particular address, he refreshed the public memory regarding the fundamental origins of that political uprising by reflecting on his arrival in the Capitol, worried sick, that the nation was dumping financial burdens onto unborn citizens at an utterly unmanageable velocity. At that specific moment in history, the federal deficit breaching the 10 trillion mark was viewed as horrifying, yet retrospectively those figures appear almost negligible when stacked against our current national predicament, which is precisely why his remarks resonate so profoundly looking backward. He cautioned that the deficit would relentlessly balloon if lawmakers continuously elevated the credit limit without structural changes, highlighting that both political factions were hooked on burning cash and predicting that the republic would ultimately suffer dire financial fallout from functioning perpetually on loaned capital, which inevitably resulted in the exact massive debt explosion he had predicted. A uniquely compelling segment of his monologue occurred when he indicted both conservative and liberal representatives for engaging in a corrupt coalition, a phrase that resonated deeply because it brought to light a grim reality that constituents across the political spectrum already quietly believed. The right wing constantly pushed for expanded defense budgets while the left wing pushed for expanded social programs, leading both factions to secretly consent to mutual budget hikes while acting like fierce adversaries for the television cameras. He essentially contended that the genuine cross-party consensus in the Capitol had nothing to do with aiding the working class, but rather centered on safeguarding federal expenditures, a critique that struck a nerve because citizens were growing increasingly exhausted by candidates running as economic traditionalists only to approve massive financial bills upon securing their seats. He candidly conceded that conservative leaders held a share of the blame for the deficit crisis, which lent substantial weight to his points, and he explicitly reminded the audience that the national balance doubled under right-wing control prior to the new administration taking power, though he maintained that the current executive branch drastically sped up the disaster. Throughout his remarks, he highlighted that the current commander-in-chief was projected to generate more financial liabilities than every prior leader put together, an assertion that seemed astonishing to the public back then, but his overarching message was that the Capitol had plunged into an entirely unprecedented epic of state expenditures. Massive trillion-dollar shortfalls were swiftly becoming the standard, huge loans were turning into everyday procedures, and virtually zero elected officials appeared genuinely panicked about the situation anymore, a reality that absolutely horrified economic traditionalists. He additionally presented a concept that countless entrenched political elites loathed acknowledging, which is the idea that the financial deficit fundamentally endangers the safety of the republic. While the majority of lawmakers discuss domestic protection strictly through the lens of armed forces capability, he inverted that logic by asserting that a country submerged in liabilities cannot maintain its power indefinitely since economic frailty inevitably transforms into tactical vulnerability, and frankly, that viewpoint has grown increasingly prevalent in modern times. The nation currently wastes astronomical sums of cash merely covering the interest rates on the federal deficit, meaning gigantic portions of citizen contributions are effectively incinerated to maintain old loans rather than upgrading public works, fortifying local neighborhoods, or lowering overall tax rates. He forewarned that this specific path might ultimately degrade the nation from the inside out, while another factor that strengthened his presentation was his attempt to make the deficit statistics comprehensible, as he understood the average citizen's struggle to truly grasp trillion-dollar amounts because such figures defy standard human imagination. Therefore, he deconstructed the data visually by depicting piles of cash stretching to unimaginable elevations simply to illustrate the sheer absurdity of the situation, a tactic that held massive political weight since the government frequently conceals its actions behind dense financial jargon. He systematically dismantled that elite rhetoric and presented the crisis in a framework that everyday citizens could easily digest, asking why the capital assumes it can burn cash infinitely without repercussions when average households certainly cannot do the same. This particular declaration struck a chord with countless citizens who suspected the national government was functioning under an entirely separate set of laws compared to the general public, and this specific aspect elevates the address far beyond a simple critique of one president. While he was undoubtedly launching a direct assault on the executive branch's strategies and genuinely felt the current leadership was rapidly accelerating financial liabilities alongside civilian reliance on the state, the foundation of his argument served as a wider alarm regarding the capital's intrinsic atmosphere, a toxic environment where representatives perpetually vow to launch expensive projects, dodge tough decisions, and presume unborn citizens will magically fix the fallout down the line. He identified the credit limit as a crucial bargaining tool, maintaining that right-leaning politicians needed to reject any increases unless profound structural adjustments were implemented beforehand. Yet lawmakers opted to grant the executive wider loaning powers while simultaneously degrading financial restrictions established in previous sessions, an action he viewed as an absolute capitulation. He contended that the capital periodically makes a single stride toward economic discipline before instantly retreating 2 paces the second public scrutiny intensifies, a critique that remains painfully precise in the modern era as both political factions continuously fail to rein in federal budgets despite openly admitting the deficit is a severe issue. The truly intriguing element today is reflecting on how fiercely the press corps and entrenched political figures brushed off these alarms back then, as economic traditionalists were frequently painted as radical zealots, simply for requesting budget reductions or financial restructuring. The prevailing narrative from numerous elite pundits was essentially that elevating the borrowing threshold was a standard procedure and challenging it was reckless, yet his objective was never to trigger a national default but rather to enforce strict liability, demanding the capital cease viewing its financial obligations as trivial, and when observing the modern condition of the Treasury, one cannot easily label those fears as paranoid. Skyrocketing prices have devastated blue-collar households in recent times. State expenditures skyrocketed throughout various emergencies. Massive shortfalls have been accepted at benchmarks that previously would have triggered legislative meltdowns, and the national balance keeps surging upward without any viable permanent remedy on the horizon. This is precisely the reason why addresses of this nature persistently circulate across the internet decades after the fact, prompting modern viewers to absorb the content and realize that perhaps a lone figure genuinely predicted this impending disaster. Regardless of whether you align with every stance the senator adopts, one cannot dispute his readiness to voice realities that countless lawmakers declined to speak publicly, as he confronted the right wing, he confronted the left wing, and he confronted the underlying financial ethos of the entire Capitol, making his sheer directness incredibly prominent during a time when most representatives dodge difficult facts due to a terror of public retaliation. The primary lesson to extract from this footage goes beyond his simple resistance to the executive branch's economic strategies, as it underscores his deep conviction that the republic was careening toward a massive generational financial collapse if lawmakers declined to alter their trajectory, maintaining that infinite credit was impossible to maintain, that both factions were betraying unborn citizens, and that average taxpayers would ultimately bear the brutal costs. That dire caution continues to shadow the nation in the present day because, regardless of the countless addresses, the endless vows, and the repetitive election catchphrases spanning the decades, the government continues burning through cash as if boundaries are non-existent and future penalties do not exist. Which perfectly explains why this vintage congressional monologue remains incredibly impactful right now. If you appreciated this analysis, please click the like button, follow the channel, and leave your opinions in the discussion section regarding whether the senator was correct about the Capitol's spending habits and the deficit emergency, or if you feel his alarms were overblown, so please share your perspective below.